In 1899, the Newsboys of New York started a figurative revolution sparked by their reaction to unfair working conditions. The Newsboys' Strike of 1899, as it was later called, was a vital step on the journey towards the child labor reforms in the coming years and had lasting effects in the newspaper industry. Newsboys, or newsies as they were sometimes called, were most commonly boys aged 11 to 15, although older girls occasionally sold papers alongside them. However, they were often excluded and discriminated against by their male counterparts. Though some worked to support their families, many were homeless, orphaned, or both. For most of American history, a majority of families couldn't afford to raise a child without them working or contributing some other economic supplement. From coal mines to cotton fields, child laborers were found everywhere, especially in the years after the Civil War due to the industrial boom and abolition of slavery. Many people saw newsies as the face of child labor due to how commonly they were seen on the streets. Every day, they would buy 100 papers for 50 cents from paper distribution stands, then disperse out across the city to sell them. At 1 cent per paper, they would have to sell over half their papers to make a profit, but that didn't always happen. Any papers that they didn't sell were their loss, so they worked up to 18-hour days trying to sell them all. In order to maximize revenue, they would shout out misleading headlines, steal money from others, and play up their impoverished nature to get sympathy from potential customers. All day, the sound of newsies hogging headlines filled the streets of New York, and the two most commonly heard names were those of the Journal and the World. Born in April of 1847, Joseph Pulitzer built his empire from humble beginnings, rising from a poor Hungarian immigrant during the Civil War to one of the most prominent publishers in the nation with his newspaper, the New York World. William Randolph Hearst, meanwhile, was born in 1863 to a wealthy San Francisco family, bought a struggling paper called the New York Journal, and subsequently converted it into a sensational success. By the time the two had established themselves as the foremost publishers in the nation, they were locked in a fierce competition to outperform each other. Their rivalry gave way to a style of reporting called yellow journalism, which relied on sensationalist headlines and exaggerated facts to boost sales. In the 1890s, Hearst used it to craft one of the most stirring stories of the decade. Cuba had been a colony of Spain for over 300 years, and they were starting to fight back. Spain took brutal measures to keep its colony in line, which Hearst highlighted in his stories. When told that war seemed unlikely, he allegedly declared, "You furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war." Thanks in no small part to the encouragement of the Journal and other newspapers, public support rapidly grew, and Congress declared war on Spain on April 25, 1898. Pulitzer and Hearst took full advantage of the conflict, constantly running extra wartime editions, sending special correspondents to the battlefields, and holding competitions for readers. All their efforts paid off, with a significant increase in circulation during the war. To make the most of the demand, and to cover the expenses incurred by their extravagant coverage, they raised the price of their papers for newsboys from 50 cents to 60 cents. At first, this price hike had little effect on the newsies because everyone was eager for news from the front lines. However, with the end of the war in December of 1898, sales became harder to come by. As the already struggling children started making even less money, tensions began to rise. On the 18th of July in 1899, this conflict came to a head when a group of newsboys overturned the paper distribution cart for the World. They chased the delivery man down the street, stole his papers, and dumped them into the Hudson River. The next day, hundreds of newsies met at City Hall Park and pledged to strike until prices were lowered. The strike was aptly timed, coinciding with a heat wave and a militant motorman protest that distracted the police. Following the examples of other strikes going on at the time, the children elected leaders and laid out their demands. Louis Belletti, known as Kid Blink due to his bad eye, was the charismatic spokesman of the strikers. He, along with David Simmons, were the strike's two primary leaders. Other prominent figures included Racetrack Higgins, Spot Conlon, and Crutch Morris. In addition to refusing to sell papers, the strikers held protests and hung banners with sayings such as "Help the Newsboys" and "Our cause is just." They marched through the streets and even shut down the Brooklyn Bridge. The strike spread through all 5 boroughs in New York and into many surrounding cities, traveling as far as Providence, Rhode Island, in addition to inspiring newsboy strikes throughout the nation. The papers, already struggling financially for their coverage of the Spanish-American War, started doing even worse. Anyone that was still selling found that there were few buyers, as the public mostly sided with the newsboys. After the rampant yellow journalism leading up to and during the Spanish-American War, public opinion was starting to sour on the two papers. They suffered a roughly 20% decrease in sales, in addition to lost advertising profits. While Hearst, whose family fortune was worth millions, knew he would be fine with the lost revenue, Pulitzer was getting anxious. If the strike dragged on for too long, he could lose the life he had built for himself, his competition was Hearst, and the world. He also felt a measure of guilt, as he knew what it was like to be a child living in poverty, fighting for every last cent just to get by. For the first time in their long rivalry, Hearst and Pulitzer were on the same side of a battle. Crossing enemy lines, Pulitzer's managing editor, Don Seitz, and Hearst's editor-in-chief, Solomon Solis Carvalho, met to discuss the solution. The two papers made numerous attempts to continue through the strike by hiring strikebreakers, or scabs as the kids called them, to sell papers in place of the newsboys. Seitz and Carvalho's idea was to hire homeless men to sell their papers. In a memo to Pulitzer, Seitz noted that the move would force the representation of the paper upon the streets, therefore landing them in the minds of the public. However, the plan failed when the scabs sided with the children and walked out on their first day. Anyone caught selling the World or Journal was brutally beaten by the newsies, many of whom were arrested. Scabs and strikers alike carried any makeshift weapons they could find, with countless scuffles breaking out. Additionally, multiple newspaper delivery men were hospitalized, making Hearst and Pulitzer even more eager for an end. As for the other papers in New York, pro-strike stories were run constantly, further adding to public support. Smaller papers such as the Sun, Tribune, and Herald were happy to see their biggest competition being put in their place by a bunch of children. With much in New York on their side and showing no signs of backing down, the Newsies held another meeting at New Irving Hall on July 24th. Over 2,000 people packed into the building, with another 3,000 spilling out onto the streets. In addition to Newsies, the rally was attended by politicians, war veterans, journalists, and other prominent figures of the time, many of whom gave speeches. They even held a competition for the best speech, which was won by none other than Kid Blink, who passionately addressed the crowd, demanding, "Ain't that 10 cents worth much to us as to Hearst and Pulitzer, who are millionaires? If they can't spare it, how can we?" The thousands in attendance, newsboys and politicians alike, cheered him on. But 2 days later, things started to fall apart. Rumors began circulating that several strike leaders had been bribed by the publishers to end the strike. And they seemed to be true when Kid Blink and David Simmons showed up in Park Row, where many newspaper offices were located, and announced that they had negotiated a settlement. Blink wore a new suit, and Simmons carried a bundle of journals, further incriminating them. An angry mob of newsboys chased Blink down the street, and he only escaped by getting arrested. He was bailed out soon after, but his reputation was shattered. Whether he and Simmons were removed from office or stepped down voluntarily is unclear, but after that incident, they were no longer the leaders of the strike. Luckily for the Newsies, however, the strike had gained enough traction and support to continue without its two most prominent leaders. When the papers offered to lower the price to 55 cents the next day, they refused to give in until they got a better deal. After a few more days of protests, fights, and rallies, they reached a compromise with the World and Journal. The price would remain at 60 cents per hundred, but the papers would buy back any unsold copies. That way, there was less risk involved for the Newsies. On August 1st, the strike formally ended in a newsboy victory. As the largest child-led strike in history, the Newsboy Strike of 1899 was a turning point in the way that child labor and labor rights in general were viewed. By the early 1900s, child labor had become a prominent social issue, and reforms started to spread throughout the nation. Legislation such as the Keating-Owen Act of 1916 and the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 raised the minimum working age, restricted the amount of time that children could work for, and banned kids from various dangerous jobs. As for the Newsies, the newly formed Newsboys Union continued fighting for the rights of themselves and others in the newspaper industry for years to come. In fact, roughly a week after the strike ended, they boycotted the Sun in support of the printers that the paper had locked out. The union spread throughout the nation, along with countless newsboy strikes that led to better wages and working conditions for newsies. Some notable examples include the Chicago newspaper strike of 1912 and a 1908 strike in Boston, both of which were against Hearst-owned papers. Although his and Pulitzer's reputations were damaged, the two continued their journalistic empires for years to come. During the strike, Hearst stayed silent, hoping to remain in the background while Pulitzer was portrayed as the villain. His efforts may have paid off, as he was mostly omitted from the 1992 movie adaptation of the story, Newsies. Through that movie and a subsequent Broadway adaptation, the legacy of the children who took on the world lives on. Although Newsies no longer sell papers today, they left a lasting mark on history, from colonial times through World War II. From daily bearers of news to revolutionaries in the crusade against child labor, newsboys showed how young orphans, immigrants, and runaways could have profound influence. These children delivered the news that would one day become America's history, thereby shaping it in the process.